Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
All right, well, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about vendor due diligence. And it's so funny because when as a compliance practitioner, I feel like when I say that and I'm like, oh, we need to do due diligence, collectively, there's just like a sigh. Everyone is like, ugh, like what is it about the term due diligence that we all just like collectively don't like? And I don't know if maybe, I've talked about rebranding compliance as like trust or assurance, whatever we want to call it, is I think vendor due diligence actually in third-party audits, third-party, onboarding, reviews, security reviews, that's all kind of encompassed in that vendor due diligence when I talk about it. I think it's ripe for a rebrand personally, because as security practitioners and compliance and honestly just professionals, when we're bringing in third parties, whether that's software, consultants, service providers, there is a level of scrutiny that all of these vendors need to hit. And the way that I normally do it is based off of classification. And, we can talk about that later on in the episode of like, how do you do that? But for me personally, I don't love when I'm talking about vendor onboarding and review that you just collectively just get that like, ugh, I don't want to do this. Because it's so important.
And as somebody who's probably done that to you or some peer reviewers at some other company I've been at, you go into this process of, hey, we need to solve a problem. We need to fix a problem. And so first of all, we have the discussion. Can we build this or do we need to go buy something? And if we decide we need to go buy it, then we've got to go through this whole thing of, okay, who are all the options? What do the analysts say? What does, my favorite chat group say? You just do a ton of research, ideally, to figure out who your options are, what are the pros and cons of those options, what do other customers of theirs have to say. You start having conversations with them, you start digging in, you get the sales pitches, you start negotiations. There's a lot that goes into it that just finding me as a technologist, what I need out of this product is a lot of work. And then to give an extreme example of this, somebody like you comes in and says, oh no, you need to go make sure that they've done this and that and the other thing. And it's like, okay, cool. Just, can I just put you in touch with them and you can have that conversation with them? Or do I need to collect these? Do you have a well-defined list that I can pass to them that they can check things off? Like, it's just another level of load. And then once all that's done, we finally decided which one we're going to go with. And we've dealt with all of the last minute, oh, but wait, we could take another 10% off if you choose us, to the losers in that choice. Now we've got to go through, we just want to get it up and running. We want to get going. And now all of a sudden, again, to be purposefully mean, someone like you comes in and says, we need to do all these other things before you can technically have them install their thing, or that you can close this contract, or, those hoops that need to be, that we all need to go through and are appropriate. Is like, oh, geez, like we're so tired of this process. We just want to be done and move forward on the actual solving of the problem. And so having come from that side, I think that's where a lot of that hesitation comes in. A lot of that eye rolling might
Is that what we call red tape? I think that's what we call red tape in my industry.
That's an aspect.
I'm pretty sure it's red tape, or at least that's what I've called it.
Yeah, so that's definitely an element of it, and hopefully my rendition of that, kind of echoes true to people that have gone through it as well, because I've been there. I've been there as a customer. I've been there as a vendor selling stuff into customers, as a partner that's just there to help connect the dots. Like it can be challenging for the technologists that just want to get stuff done.
Yeah, I mean, I can walk through like a recent example, right? Because I completely hear what you're saying, right? Unfortunately, in a lot of companies, even small, medium, or big, it just takes a lot to get somebody brought in. And I've seen certain companies do it really well, where it's super efficient and quick. And then sometimes you're like, how was that so quick? Did you guys look at everything? I haven't yet really seen a company do this like super well. I've seen good tooling that can help, and we can definitely talk about that maybe later on in the episode or on another one. But the vendor due diligence, I think it gets tied into this it's a necessary evil. And we've talked about a couple necessary evils on some other episodes. And for me, it's a cultural thing. So I consider compliance, security, IT needs to be a part of the procurement process as early as possible without wasting their time. Because I will say, as a compliance practitioner, and generally, like, I'm somebody who comes in, right, and I can help evaluate tools, I can help onboard them, I can be doing the negotiations in the meantime. I'm also a lawyer, right? So, like, sometimes I am actually the one who's negotiating the agreements with clients, to making sure that they meet their particular security requirements or their other legal requirements. And so it's interesting because every company does this differently, and there's different functions that are at play. And there's compliance, but I think compliance is broader because compliance could be legal could be compliance. There's also privacy, which, if it's a global agreement, right, or a vendor that's maybe not in the United States or not in your local country, then there are different concerns at play. And then there's IT, right, which is making sure, like, does it fit into the actual system? Are they going to be able to help onboard the team to make sure that the onboarding, offboarding, data lifecycle works well? And then there's also just security, and is the tool actually up to the company's standards? And I say company standards because every company's security baseline is different. Every company's risk tolerance is completely different. You might have all adopted a single standard, but that means implementation industry wide, company wide, is literally different in every single company. And that's why it is so hard to regulate these things, in my personal opinion. What I would say is the things I've seen the most successful is get the right people in the room.
And
Virtual
that,
room, totally fine. I work from home full time. I'm a big virtual girly, but get everybody in the room and ask them what works best for them and write it out, and then see if that's the process that you want to start following.
yeah. And again, speaking to my comrades in IT, think about those times when the business goes out and buys a product and then dumps it in your lap and says, "Hey, we need to go implement this." You want to have a seat at that table as soon as possible. Compliance is asking for the same thing. Security is asking for the same thing. They just want to make sure that we don't have to backtrack any work that's been done, and make sure that those things are considered from the beginning, so that there's no
I
duct
will
tape and bail
say,
wire.
legal might not be saying the same thing. They really don't want to be involved until you're ready to sign. I'm going to be
Yeah,
honest, generally, like, legal, from the way that I've seen it, usually wants to be like on the back end as like oh, let's go. And ideally, right, everything else has already been negotiated. It's
yeah,
unfortunate for legal, right, if they don't have compliance and security experience, then for them to be negotiating commercial terms that are like pretty straightforward, to then suddenly have like, oh, there's a security addenda, or like, oh, by the way, like, compliance is saying we need this thing, and legal is like, I don't know what that thing is. And then suddenly that's where it gets slower. So again, making sure that legal is in the room, also very important, because I've seen a lot of other companies bring in legal too late. And then that is part of that brand, where not only compliance is red tape, but legal definitely has that brand too. I think maybe even more than compliance, in my
yeah,
personal experience. So it's, how do you get away from that culture of like, procurement isn't a team? It's like, shouldn't just be a single person, definitely shouldn't be a single team. It is a cross functional thing that requires different stakeholders, and then let them tell you when they want to be engaged. And then ideally, right, build a system that tags them automatically when you have certain things. I would absolutely encourage companies, think about the workflow ahead of time, and then work with your IT team, right, to see how can we automate this within our existing systems to make it easy, so that those people get alerted automatically when it's like, hey, it's your turn.
yeah,
Like, do your thing, so that those reviews can be happening simultaneously, because there's no reason why like compliance and legal can't be doing their reviews at the same time, in the same way that like IT might be maybe involved sooner when they're like potentially helping source tools, but then they might have a backseat until like compliance and security and legal and privacy have all been like, yeah, we're good. And then IT's like, okay, great, I'm ready to go. Let's tie it into our SSO provider and let's move. Because
yeah,
IT usually just wants to go.
yeah, yeah. And again, that's kind of the key to the scenario I laid out earlier, is that IT people want to solve problems. Like, they're there to make the things happen. I've got a presentation where I talk about the difference between IT and security, and talk about IT being stuck in the roundabout. Like, it's mass chaos, and it's designed to just let things flow as quickly and maybe not efficiently, but as much bandwidth as fast as possible. Whereas security tends to be, they're not saying no to everything. They're saying no very selectively to make sure things are efficient and are happening in a controlled manner so that, less accidents happen and less danger happens. So, we all have to kind of accept the fact that we have differing views, and ideally, there needs to be a process built around the needs of all those different teams.
Yeah, and again, I think getting buy-in in that process, especially if you're at like a smaller company or a startup, is hard because generally the way this normally happens, at least in what I've seen in places you and I have worked and other just kind of things, that if you're working in startups, usually everyone is buying their own tooling and then it kind of becomes like an island of tools.
Yeah.
What I always say when I like start working with different clients and start working is, one is just like, what are the tools?
Yeah.
And it freaks me out how often people are like, I have no clue what the tools are. And then
Yep.
normally, if you're at that, like my recommendation on this one would be like, figure out who knows who pays for the tools.
Yeah.
And that is the best starting point of where your tools sit. Because a lot of companies, even the big companies, like they just don't do this super well. There's too many systems. And so like, it's really easy for employees to like use a corporate card, right? And just like get a software. And unfortunately, like unless your system is super secure and really hardened, your people might not know about it. So I would say get the process, but make sure that there's like backstops in place and like there actually are those red tapes. Maybe they're like little red flags that are like, hey, you can't do that. So making sure that people maybe don't have enough privilege, it's tricky, right? It's really,
Yeah.
this is where that finesse is of like, you don't want security and compliance to hold people back too much, so that because they need to be able to do their jobs. I've seen the most success if you do it by classification of data.
It's definitely a tough balance. And there are all sorts of things that play into that become more of a focus for IT that used to be kind of the realm of compliance. So things like vendor supply chain management is huge in the security space now because of incidences that we've seen that involve, hey, I'm trusting this particular vendor A, and they're building their product on vendor B's technology, and vendor B's building their technology on vendor C's technology. Now you've got this chain of vendors that if one of them introduces something funky or insecure or old and it gets taken advantage of, I, as the consumer of that big chain, have no idea that that widget that vendor C is using has a vulnerability. And this crosses into vulnerability management, which is another whole thing that is both operational and security focused. But as far as that supply chain is concerned, I may not know that. Does vendor B know that? Does vendor A know that? Like, who in that chain is responsible at that point for notifying me as the customer that I have to do something?
The best is they all don't know. That's the best part. I think is the reality is we all don't know.
Well,
So
in having been a developer in the past, I understand how that happens because, again, uh, that IT mindset of I just want to get something done. I need to solve this problem so I can move on to the bigger problem. I've got the small thing that got in my way. And so, cool, there's a library that'll solve that. I'm going to pull that down. I'm going to import it into my project. I'm going to solve that one problem and I'm going to keep moving. And 6 months, a year, 5 years later, I've forgotten I even used that particular tool. I may not be with the company anymore. Nobody knows I use that tool. How do you deal with that? Because now all of a sudden there's a massive flaw. There's a 10.0 CVSS score. How do I deal with that? Is huge. And so, there are legal frameworks being put in place as we speak that are defined to, we need to manage that. And all of you out there creating software and consuming software need to make sure you're accounting for that as well.
I'm going to push you on if they're actually legal frameworks or not, but I think that might be a formal debate we can have later. The vulnerability management part of it and patch management is a huge part of compliance and security programs that I think a lot of companies aren't exactly sure how to deal with. And the way that it normally plays out is, and I'll explain this for our listeners, is really like as a compliance practitioner, if you have a proactive patch management program, incredible, gold star, you really should, right? Ideally, your teams, you have like a dedicated SOC, a security on call that is managing vulnerabilities and like patching your systems constantly, whether that is hardware, you know, your platform, or potentially like some of your software solutions. It depends, right, how every company is set up and what type of cloud instance they're in. And we can, Brian will definitely be more of the expert on this one. So we can definitely have him talk to us about that and what that looks like in different scenarios. But what I would say is that's the dream state, and most companies don't have that.
Yeah.
And that means, like I'm saying, as listeners, if you get the budget and spend to get security on call resources, yes, do it, please. It's better than nothing, because there's nothing more stressful than when you have a customer, especially like a big customer, reach out and say, "Hi, I believe you're using this thing, and that thing has had a really big breach. What are you doing about it?"
Yeah.
That's not a fun scenario to be in. It's called retroactive compliance and security, and it's very stressful. That is where it feels like everything is on fire, and you're trying to figure out, like, oh shoot, who manages the relationship with that vendor? Are we even impacted? What, and exactly as you just said, Brian, like, are we still using that thing? And again, it's not fun when that comes from your biggest customer. And you should assume that, like, because they're your biggest customer, they probably have better compliance and security resources than you do. So they
Yeah.
actually might have proactive patch management, and that's why they're asking.
Yeah. And that's tough. It's just so tough as a customer and as a vendor. Like it's a no-win scenario for both sides. We oftentimes, I kind of touch on this, but we think a lot about the security implications of vulnerability management. But there's also an operational side of that where you may have bugs that lead to unsecurity type problems, usually involving availability more than anything else. That patch corrupts some core DLL, and the next time you reboot that Windows server, it just doesn't come up properly. Not a security incident. There's not a CVE for it, but it's something that is going to cause availability problems and potentially data loss issues and all those other things that we try to protect against. And we focus so much on security these days because it is so in our face, but those type of operational issues still exist and can still happen. And you've got to manage those things, and you've got to manage it in a way that is aware of the fact that you don't know everything you're running in your environment. Unless you've got a really good supply chain where you dig into every product, what maybe a quarter of a percentage point of companies actually do that.
They
You
should,
got to
right?
manage
Oh
all
my
of it.
gosh, that's the dream state for me, is like if every company
Mm-hmm.
was using, well, again, there's like some privacy and security risks associated with using like data discovery tools and figuring out like where everything sits, because it like is starting to feel like a lot of surveillance in your actual databases. But there's something to be said about data discovery actually being one of the most powerful things that a lot of companies, I think, just don't think is worth the money right now.
Yeah,
Like they're
and
like,
that's
that feels like a nice to have, not a must have.
yeah, and even on the security thing that you mentioned before, where do they spend the money? Do they spend it on a CISO to oversee the entire operation and make sure everything's happening? Do they spend it on a technical person that's going to be able to sit there and actually watch things happen and actually do the patching and things like that? Those are both important aspects of it. And which one do you start with? If you can only hire one of those two, which one do you start with? Honestly, I tend to be the type of person that it's important to have people to do the work, but if you've got none of that going on right now and it's maintainable, you want to focus on the higher level policies, procedure side of things, so that when you do bring in people, when you do bring in systems and products, and this hopefully will bring us back on track to the topic at
I
hand.
was actually about to pull us back too. So
Yeah.
good job.
You've got that high level strategic person in a CISO type of mindset that will be able to say, I can help you define what that policy is, what that procedure will be for onboarding a new vendor, and make sure that the right things are being considered and tagged on. Anybody can fill those roles until we can hire dedicated professionals to do those things. And ideally, a good CISO has had experience and could probably fill into that too. But now you could build that framework in which to put things on. Of course, that doesn't work when your hair's on fire and you've got to solve the problems. But it's better, it's always better to deal with it before your hair's on fire anyway.
I think a lot of us feel that way in our worlds of, we're like, oh,
Yeah.
why does it feel like we're firefighters all the time? And I do think that I would just echo what you said. If we're thinking about vendor management and making due diligence feel less icky for whatever reason that is, and I do, like, I would love to hear from our listeners if they have like a better term for what they're using for, because procurement to me is broader. Due diligence to me is also tied to like M&A transactions, which also people hate those. So like, due diligence isn't like a good term for it. If it's vendor management, I think that starts to get confusing. So again, listeners, please do send us an email with your ideas or interact with us on LinkedIn and let us know what you think it should be called, because I think vendor due diligence is not the right term. But I think there's a culture to be had about like the vendor life cycle. And maybe that's where I feel
Mm-hmm.
good about it. I think I'm probably more somebody personally that would say I would call it your vendor life cycle, and who are the stakeholders across the organization, and do they know their parts? Are they aware? And can you automate something to make sure that those people are told when? Because there's, again, as you said, IT doesn't love not knowing about a tool. Compliance really doesn't love not knowing about a tool, especially when you're in audit. There is nothing like having to defend a company in audit when some software engineer mentions like, oh, well, we do this and this thing. And then the auditor is like, huh, that wasn't in your database. And then you're like, I am going to have to take that one offline
Yeah.
and I'm going to have to get back to you. And that's like, it puts you in that, it basically calls the whole program into question when compliance or audit, whatever it is, right? Whichever team it is defending the company with external auditors. There's a reason that those things have to look good, because basically if one team is saying, hey, we do it this way and these are the systems we use and we're positive that those are the systems, and then someone is being audited and mentions a new system, the whole thing is called into question. And that is then suddenly you are in like audit, like a wormhole of just trying to be like, whoa, 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 like,
Yeah.
let's confirm. I need to just like follow up with you. And then it starts to feel more like, again, you're on the defense. You've lost control of the audit at that moment. And that's not a
Yeah.
fun feeling to have. I can say that from personal experience. But,
Yeah.
I would say coming up with the automation. And again, I don't think it needs to be a flashy tool. I would love to bring on some flashy tools and learn from them. And I think if you have the budget and spend, absolutely great. But can it be something that your IT team has within them that is just like a documented process that maybe compliance, procurement, legal, security all sign off on and feel good about their parts and can take ownership of it? And then who is responsible for actually making sure that it stays enforced?
Yeah.
Because processes and policies are only as good if executive management, especially in small companies, know they exist and choose to follow them.
Yep. Yeah. And that's where those higher level strategic roles can really pay off.
In your ideal state, in a hypothetical scenario that none of our listeners are going to hold us accountable for, would you potentially prefer like a higher level CISO type person, or would you prefer more
yeah.
of a security practitioner?
I think if you're in a scenario where your hair isn't on fire and things are manageable at the individual contributor level, you need to get that higher level. And it may not be a CISO; it's somebody that can fill that role for the CISO. Bring them in to be able to start defining a framework before things have hit the fan, because you need to have that top level support. To your point, it's not going to work if you create a process and nobody follows it. And especially if the top level is willing to subvert it every chance they have to encounter it, it's worthless. And that's where you need that high level support to have, somebody that, sits directly under the president of the company to say, you need to follow this process because it's important for security and it's important for compliance, and push them back into line and have them follow that process. So again, with the caveat that, the place isn't burning down around you, and you're in the midst of a ransomware event, you're not looking to go hire a CISO at that point. You need to do it beforehand.
Yeah, and I'm going to go that like traditional consultant route and go, well, it depends.
Well, of course,
But
that's
in
always
my
the answer.
ideal world, I'm helping companies do this. And so if it's me, right, great, then I can fill that role. But if it's a smaller company and their executive leadership team understands the importance of security and compliance, then maybe it is just like a lower level security practitioner that can help set the baseline and give them the opportunity to kind of get additional experience on like building out a security program. Even better if you give them like some additional help from somebody maybe that does this professionally, but whoever that is.
There is a concept of a vCISO or a fractional CISO where you can have somebody come in for a number of hours a week and help you do these things. So
Yeah,
by no means is it we have to go start up the whole hiring engine and have to find some ex-CIA person to come in and be our CISO. It could be somebody to just jumpstart the process.
Yeah. If only we knew such a person. Anyways.
Mystery to be solved.
Yeah. I will say I have one question for you before we kind of wrap up.
Yep.
What do you think it should be called instead? What do you think for like vendor due diligence? Are you okay with that, or do you think it should be called something different?
Honestly, I'm not opposed to the due diligence phrase. I think that those of you who have been through an acquisition situation or merger situation have dealt with that, whereas the rest of us haven't as much. Um, I think it works. So it
Does
works for
that make
me.
sense? You don't
Uh,
get the like M&A deal scaries when you hear due diligence? Because I do. But maybe
not so
that's my
much.
background.
I think that's more your background. I view due diligence as a very generic phrase,
Great.
as something that isn't tied to any specific process, procedure, thing. I see where you're coming from in your reaction to that, but at the same
Well,
time, that may speak well to IT people. But if the compliance side is going to have heartache about that, then it's worth a conversation about pulling out the thesaurus and find other words to use.
uh, um, no, I will say the only thing I think is a shortcoming about vendor due diligence is I think due diligence is generally like on the onset of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
I think vendor due diligence starts to not feel as these are annual reviews.
Yeah.
Because I would say one thing we haven't talked about today, and I think is important to note before we wrap up the episode, is that just because you brought somebody on and they were excellent when you brought them on and you looked at all their stuff does not mean that you shouldn't continue to review and audit their things in
Mm-hmm.
whatever that looks like for your organization.
Yeah. I mean, the business space evolves, the technical things you do as a business evolve, the compliance landscape
The
evolves. Like
people,
the people evolve, the people get better, the people change. Evolution is the guaranteed. Like things are going to change, things are going to happen that you need to constantly divert to or towards or away from. So, you know, compliance is pretty obviously that way right now too.
due diligence. It is kind of like, it feels
Whatever.
like very serious. It feels very
Yeah.
serious to me. It
I
feels
mean,
like a serious thing.
yeah. I mean, to me, due diligence invokes we've got a very specific set of things we need to figure out, and we need to abide by those as thoroughly as possible before we can move through.
And again, try to bring those people in sooner because
Mm-hmm.
mutually on both sides, I don't think people like to be like I don't like when I've had to slow people down.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm positive that you on the other side probably have also not liked being slowed down, especially when you are just
No.
trying to solve a problem and you needed potentially a tool or a vendor to solve that issue quickly.
Yeah. One thing I've learned, and this gets into the enforcement from the top down to make sure everybody does have to jump through that hoop, is the sooner I get those things taken care of, as if I'm still in if I wait to call you in as compliance or as marketing or as security or whoever, name whoever else needs to be involved in this decision. If I wait till all my work is done, I have nothing to do but to hand it to you and wait. If I call you in at the beginning and say, okay, I've narrowed it down to my top four, these are the ones we're going to go evaluate from a technical perspective. We need you to evaluate from a security perspective and from a compliance for yada yada yada. Like if we can line all these up together, it's going to be a faster process overall because we're going to multi-thread at that point. And a really mature organization will have a list of compliance questions, a list of legal, a list of security questions that I can go ask before I even have to bring you in, and you can be like, okay, yep, you asked all the right questions. I think we're good.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Give people the things that they want and ask for ahead of time so that you're also not scrambling doing it. I always have to learn that. I want
Yeah.
to just help. And sometimes I slow myself down because I'm like, I'm too involved. And so, in the sense of like empowering people to like make the decisions on their own and then bring in the right people in the room is only that's just great culture. That's positive across. I mean, every
Mm-hmm.
professional that listens to us is like, oh my god, delegation and not micromanagement. Yay, we love that. Like we're all that's everybody's brand. So
Yep.
I think that's a happy place for us to wrap up. We're very excited to have continued engagements with our listeners. Where can they reach out to us?
Yeah. If you want to engage with us, whether it's show ideas or you want to call us out on something that we made a point of, or call us out because we didn't make a point on something, reach us at info@socializingsecurity.com. Is today the best way. You can find us on LinkedIn as well and hit either of us up individually or hit us up in our shared space for socializing security. More to come on that front. Ideally, we're going to have a more direct real-time communication channel that we'll get set up and be able to build community. And the ultimate goal is to get us all socializing and talking about these types of things and sharing ideas with one another. So we're really looking forward to engaging with people as part of this.
Yeah, agreed. And I will just say, I really want to know what our audience thinks about what it should be called. If it's vendor due diligence, if that's just my bias showing and my personal experience, which is completely valid and fair, or is it a more like compliance culture that maybe it should be? I'm going to nominate vendor lifecycle.
Fair
That
enough.
one feels the best for me.
I like that one too, because it implies that it doesn't end concept. Whereas due diligence is more of a, hey, we need to get from point A to point B, and then we'll be done with it. So I do like that.
All right. Well, we'll see you on the next episode.
Yep. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.